Welcome to this fourth of the NCSE's online trainings on media skills and activist skills. This time we're going to be talking about media skills. We've got an exciting panel here, so I'm going to turn this over to them pretty quickly. I just want to say thank you all for being here. And I hope that you will check out if you weren't part of the past ones, I hope you'll go to the NCSC website and check out the recordings of past ones. This one will be recorded. If it's useful, I hope that you'll point other people to it down the road. You will all, at the end of this, get an email survey asking you what you thought, and we will take your suggestions into account, so please do fill that survey out and give us your feedback. We're going to have some presentations from the panelists, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. For those of you who haven't used this GoToWebinar software before, you can ask a question either by typing in the questions pane on the side of your screen. There's a tab that says questions where you can type in. Okay, I'm getting some people typing in already saying that they're getting bad audio from me. So, but yeah, so you can type that in there and we can type responses back, or I can read those questions off. And you can also, there's a little hand icon on the side of the screen where you can say that you want to raise your hand if you want to make a comment, if you want to be able to speak. So, I just muted everyone else. Hopefully that will make the audio a little bit better. And I'm going to turn this over to, we're going to start off hearing a little bit from Erin Heath, who is at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She's the Assistant Director for Government Relations, if I'm remembering correctly, and a former journalist, and going to talk about she's a presentation that she's done a few times, talking to scientists about how to talk to the media, and hopefully a little bit about what you can expect from them. If you have questions, you can type them in, and I can either answer offline or raise that later on. So without further ado, I will unmute Erin and show the screen and turn it over to her.
Okay, great. Thank you, Josh. As Josh said, government relations at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and I'm also a former journalist and media relations professional for the Scientific Society. As you can see, my talk is called Engaging with the Media, the quick version, because this is a very, very short snippet of a larger workshop that AAAS gives. I handle surrounding evolution and climate education, so some of you may have spoken with me over email or phone. I'm going to set the scene, and then I believe my co-panelists are going to present some case studies. So I'll start by talking about the media landscape and culture, and then provide a few tips on engaging with journalists. So first of all, why should you be interested in communicating with the media? You're all here, so I think that means you're already interested. Thank you. There are a lot of reasons, but there are three key reasons that I see, and one of them is that you can increase interest and awareness in your area of work or expertise. You also make your issue interesting and relevant to people's lives, and you can advance your own career and develop skills to advance your own career. So let's talk a little bit about why this can sometimes be challenging. You can see here from this first slide that the culture of science and the culture of journalists, it says the public here, but I think it applies to journalists, are polar opposite. Scientists value lots and lots of data and projects that sometimes take a long time, and journalists value the bottom line and getting things right away, getting information quickly. So, so this is the first thing to really be aware of, that you're coming from different cultures. Another important thing to, be aware of is that the media landscape is changing. We are in the post-print era. As you can see here, newspaper circulations are shrinking, shrinking, shrinking. A lot of newspapers have now gone completely online. And another thing to note is that it used to be that most major papers had science desks, and that's unfortunately not the case anymore. Sometimes a paper may have a single science reporter or no science reporters, so that makes it doubly important for people who care about science to reach out. TV landscape, you can see this is what it looked like in '85. This is what it looks like now. And of course, we also have the web. And as you can see, more and more people are turning to the internet to get their news. So you can see how important that's become. And social media is also a critical tool to get your message out. And remember, I want to point out that journalists are also media consumers. And so social media is not only a great way to spread your message to the public, but to interact with journalists. So moving on a little bit to communicating with the media, the reporter's job is to talk to multiple sources and then to weigh the evidence and use the most relevant bits of evidence. The reporter also has to think about making his or her editor or producer happy and writing or producing in his or her own style. Also, oftentimes, stories have to be done very, very quickly. And a lot of times there isn't a lot of space or time to do them. I'll tell you what a reporter's job isn't. It's not to make you happy. It's not to know everything about the topic. A lot of times they won't. They're often consummate generalists. Their job is not to include everything you say in the story or produce the story the way you wish it were produced. And also the journalist often doesn't share the story with you before it appears. So that's something to be prepared for. Your job is to share credible and accurate information. Be prepared, plan your message out, prepare for questions on the topic, and of course, if you do have an interview, show up for it. So when you talk about preparing a message, there's three really key points that I'd like to put across. And the first one is to think about the audience. The audience wants to know what's in it for me. Or another way that I like to say is, who cares, right? You should always, always include why someone should care about your issue. Secondly, what's the bottom line? Make sure that you have your key message or messages in mind. Bring them out. Make sure they come out in the interview or press release or whatever it is, however it is you're engaging. And finally, then support that bottom line with facts, examples, and stories. Stories, I think, are incredibly critical because they are often what people remember. So let's say you do get the interview. There are a few keys to a good interview, and the first one is to avoid jargon. We all have jargon, and that's okay, but don't bring it out in the interview. Illustrate your point. Again, use anecdotes, use analogies, use stories. This is what people remember, and it helps people to understand and relate. Again, bring out your important points and put them first. If you ever look at a straight news story, you'll see that the most important information is often in the first paragraph. So you should mirror that line of thinking. The next tip is probably obvious, but try not to say anything that you wouldn't want repeated back to you later. And finally, be confident. This isn't always easy, especially if you're doing it for the first time, but be confident. You are the expert, and there's a reason that the journalist wanted to talk to you. I like to put in this quote. It's a great quote by Albert Einstein. You don't really understand something until you can explain it to your grandmother. So if you don't feel that your grandmother could understand it, keep honing that message. I want to say that we need you. We need scientists, engineers, educators, and members who are of the community who are interested in science. We need you to engage as much as you can. So for those of you who are looking for opportunities, there are a number of ways to identify those. First is look to colleagues or people you know. If you're known as an expert to them, they will often recommend you to journalists. And on the flip side, if you know a colleague who's already very engaged with the media, talk to that person. Find out how they do it and who their contacts are. For those of you who are in a university setting, your campus Office of Communications is a great resource. Definitely reach out to them, let them know who you are, what you do, and that you want to engage. And of course, I want to point out our own resources at AAAS. We have a communicating science website, which I'll show you on the last slide. That's part of our Center for Public Engagement with Science and Technology. And another project that I'm involved with that I have to put in is for those of you interested in the policy side and advocating from a legislative perspective. We have a website called Engaging Scientists and Engineers in Policy. That's AAAS.org/ESCP. So last slide, I wanted to show this again. It's AAAS.org/communicating science. It's got all of the tips I just flew through and a whole lot more. It's got videos, it's got interviews with journalists, it's got information about bringing workshops to your own campus or organization, and a whole lot more. So with that, I want to thank you and turn it over to the next speaker.
Thanks, Erin. If there are any questions out there really quickly, we can do that. Otherwise, we can just move along to the next speaker. One thing that I would just add that I think is not the intuitive advice, but as sort of a big general guideline, is when you're talking to the media, don't be afraid to repeat yourself. That's something that we're not trained to do, right? We want to say something new every time we open our mouths because otherwise it's boring. But when you're talking to reporters, they don't know by repeating yourself, you're telling them this is important. And it's a way to just emphasize repetition builds retention, and you'll say it different ways the second time than you said the first time. And the second time might be more quotable. By the end, you'll have narrowed it down to that little 5-second clip that the reporter loves, and they will have gotten you away from the jargon and some of the other stuff. So, it's practice and take your time with it. And usually reporters are pretty helpful about that, and they'll tell you if you're going a little bit off the rails. And so we're going to turn this now over to, we had a plan and then we weren't sure exactly what we decided, but I think that the idea was that we were going to go to NCSC's communications director, Robert Lunn, next. He's been a journalist in various ways for longer than I can even begin to count, and has been working here for a long time now, and has a lot of experience dealing with reporters and dealing with the media around these issues that I know you all are interested in as well. So I've got his presentation up. I'm going to unmute him and turn it over.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? You can. Okay. How will I go about advancing the slides, Josh?
You control the mouse and the keyboard, so you can just go forward.
So I can just use the space bar?
Yeah.
To move them? Okay. Well, yes, my name's Robert Lunn. I was a journalist when Josh was knee-high to a zygote, so it's been a long time, about 30, 35 years. Did a lot of technology journalism as well as science journalism, so been around the block a bit. And I've dealt with the press, of course, as a member of the press for a long, long time. So it's interesting being the communications director here for the last 5 years and dealing with my brethren across the desk. And as Josh was noting, never hurts to repeat yourself with a member of the press, and certainly in some ways less is more, in the sense of you should likewise hone your message and come up with your talking points and really get to the gist of what you want to say pretty quickly, because most journalists will just kind of be sitting there waiting for the key phrase to come along while you're kind of giving them a long discourse. Like I said, short's good. Shorter can be better. But in any case, as director of communications, I do things that a lot of nonprofits and small science groups and grassroots groups basically have to do themselves. We're fortunate enough that we can actually have a director of communications to do certain kinds of things. But what do I do is kind of like what you'd end up doing, at least in part. I mean, the key things I do are press relations, social media stuff, dealing with events and promotions. And with press relations, that means I'm talking to members of the press and bloggers. I'm talking to newspapers, magazines, all this kind of stuff. I generate stories, press releases, backgrounders, talking points, all that kind of stuff. and I track the coverage of our organization, and I track the coverage of the topic, in our case, evolution and climate change, on a day-to-day basis. As you might imagine, I likewise deal with social media stuff. I mean, I'm managing our Facebook accounts and YouTube and Twitter. We've got a blog that we launched about 6 months ago, and I've been some sort of the managing editor of that. I do things like acquire and edit and post downloadable book chapters from books that are relevant to us, and that's an interesting way of sort of bringing people to your site. And of course, there's events and promotions. I mean, stuff like, I mean, we have award dinners. And why are the slides advancing, Josh? Josh?
I thought you were talking about how you were doing social media, so I thought I would advance to that slide.
Ah, well, okay. Just checking.
But I don't.
I was.
If that wasn't your plan, I apologize.
No. That's fine. So anyway, so like I said, in terms of events and promotions, we have award events like our Friend of Darwin Award. We have we have contests sometimes with our members. Sometimes we survey our members. We also go to conferences quite a lot. We'll go to the National Association of Biology Teachers. We'll go to education conferences and so on. And that again kind of comes within my purview as the communications director. So anyway, so what are we going to talk about today? Well, I'm going to talk about a case study, an example of what a campaign can kind of look like when something happens and your organization has to respond. What do you do? What's involved, let's say, on the communication side of that? And again, at NCSC, we're fortunate enough to have enough folks and a dedicated director of communications to do this sort of thing. But in your organization or your group, it may be something that all of you do in some fashion. And what I'm going to talk about here is, I wouldn't expect you to be able to do all of this. But you can certainly do what you could depending on your situation. But I'll kind of go through the whole rigmarole here of what I did for this one campaign to kind of like give you the big picture. And the campaign in question, and let's see if I can advance a slide. And I can't advance a slide. Josh, next slide, please. There we go. Okay. So anyway, so what's the deal? A while back, this creationist by the name of Ray Comfort decided that, well, Darwin's Origin of Species is a great book, and it's public domain. I'm going to put out my own version of this with my very special introduction, my very special 50-page introduction. And as you can imagine, Ray had some interesting things to say about evolution and Darwin and how, Darwin was responsible for Adolf Hitler and on and on and on. It was just a lot of balderdash, to say the least, if I dare use a word that strong. So suffice it to say, Ray Comfort, had a bunch of these books printed up and had them. The plan was for him to distribute them at universities across our fair land, United States as well as Canada, maybe 100 universities and colleges, passing out copies of this, I wouldn't say adulterated version of the Origin, but certainly this amended version with this, again, this 50-page introduction. So we thought, like, how are we going to respond to this? What do we do? I mean, we can't be at every university and college in the United States. How can we use social media to get our point across? How can we equip people in those locales at those colleges to kind of not confront Ray, shall we say, but certainly gainsay him? So one of the first things we did was, and let me see if I can, one more time, see if I can advance a slide. And okay, this is the Origin of Species book that Ray Comfort came out with. This was his special edition, timed to coincide with Darwin's 150th anniversary of the publication of said Origin. So this is the book he was pushing on campuses. And so I thought, well, all right, what's the first thing we kind of need to do? I think when something like this happens, you need to respond quickly. I mean, you've got to lay out your priorities as soon as possible, figure out what your goal is, and then, create a SWAT team of folks in your organization, staffers, volunteers, academics, whatever, and kind of get them organized to deal specifically with the problem at hand. In this particular case, we thought, well, we're going to come up with a dedicated website that kind of pokes fun at Ray and also kind of informs people about the distortions in this specific version of Origin of Species. And so one of the first things we did was, acquire a website domain, because we had a feeling we were going to use this, and we came up with one, don'tdisdarwin.com, and suffice to say that it was good to have an end. But like I said, first thing, respond quickly, get a bunch of people together, sort of like your SWAT team, assign duties, figure out what your goal is or goals, and move forward. One of the first things we did, next slide please, one of the first things we did was develop talking points. And this is not an unusual thing where you've got an issue that's going on. You go, what do we want to tell the public? I mean, if you watch the Colbert Report or the Daily Show, and you see them cycling through videos of people from the administration, and they're all saying the same thing, that's because they had talking points. So for this particular thing, we wanted to figure out, well, what do we want to talk about? How do we want to basically deflate Ray Comfort's whole claim here? We thought, all right, we'll come up with a one-page talking points sheet that would serve multiple purposes. This is a way of saving time and saving effort. One talking sheet that your staff can use, that people who are out there in the field who are gainsaying this guy can use, that the press can look at. It's the perfect little summation of what the issue was about. And in this case, we said, okay, what are the things we can really attack here? We can attack it very clearly by Ray is trotting out bad science. He doesn't understand the history, and he doesn't understand the theology. And of course, on our staff, we have scientists, historians, and theologians, so we were able to draw on these folks pretty quickly. But suffice to say, the one-page talking point sheet is really handy because you can give it to people who are interested in the issue. You can give it to journalists. You can use it for your staff. You get a phone call, somebody wants to interview you about this and say, what's Ray Comfort all about? Isn't he, onto something? And you say, no, bad science, bad history, bad theology, and let me quote you some stuff. There it is. Next slide, please. So what follows that? Well, the thing is, you're going to have some journalists coming to you who are pretty deep into the topic. I mean, they're science journalists. They've been writing about the topic for a long time, and they've written books and so on, although a lot of journalists just indeed are generalists. For those who are not, those who dig deeper, who are science writers and experienced, they may want something that's more detailed that they can use for a more pointed piece. And this is where you develop sort of the detailed blow-by-blow analysis. It doesn't have to be every paragraph, commented on. It doesn't have to be 50 pages. 5 pages is more than enough. And in this particular case, we created a 5-page document that basically took the biggest dumb things that Comfort said and just sort of, delineated them and sort of exposed them for what they were. So in this particular analysis, we have block of quotations from something that Comfort says, and then we have our response to it, and we obviously dispute his take on the history and on the science and so on. But suffice to say, it's deep and detailed. And some of your journalists are going to want something like this, if only to call on if they need it. Suffice to say, if you're giving them a one-page talking point and you're giving them this blow-by-blow analysis, they've got a lot of things that they can mine for quotes. So good thing to have them on hand. Next slide, please, Josh. Okay, so the next thing you want to do after you've developed your talking points and developed your blow-by-blow analysis is you want a contact list. In other words, you want to figure out who the heck are you going to talk to about this, who are you going to reach out to. And one of the people you might be wanting to talk to are academics at a local college who might be supporting your goal here, local press, local college newspapers, local bloggers, alternative press, local radio stations, whatever. So the question is, where do you find these guys? Well, if you have the money, and we didn't have the money, but if you have the money, you can lay out $5,000 or $6,000 to organizations like PR Newswire and BusinessWire.com, who have these media guides where they have all the people who work for ABC or NBC or CBS or whatever all delineated out, the background, their contact information, phone numbers, email. It's great. And we couldn't afford it. I got to look at one for about half an hour once and managed to get at least a rough idea of what was going on. But I went to this site, newslink.org, I believe it is, and this site is not totally up to date, but it's up to date enough so that if you go into the site and you go, I want to find newspapers in Indiana, and I want to find newspapers specifically in Indianapolis, this is how you get to it. So this particular site lists newspapers, radio, TV, and so on and so forth, and this is how I built my contact list. Now, for a local campaign, it's a little bit easier. If this is something going on in, let's say, Dallas, then it's a fairly small subset. You'll have a half dozen TV stations, radio stations, whatever. Suffice to say, this is the way to get to these folks. Another thing that's very handy is that if you're searching for bloggers, or if you find bloggers in a given area, let's say like Denver again, the question is like, how do you find more of the right kind of bloggers in question? Well, it's that good old-fashioned blog rule. When you look at a blog and you see their posts on the right-hand side, they'll often have a little boxed item that's called a blog roll. Basically, them talking about blogs that they like. And if you start trolling the blog rolls, you'll find lots of other like-minded bloggers who are into this topic in question. So that's a good way of finding bloggers. With newspapers that you're going to be talking to, let's say like the daily newspapers, major metro newspapers, things like that, you're probably looking for education writers, science writers, and or metro editors. With a big newspaper, they're going to have people who are very definitely assigned to, let's say, education or to science or the environment. But for smaller newspapers, they won't have people like that. And the person you typically want to talk to is the metro editor. That's the guy or gal you want to talk to. With TV, you want to talk to news directors, political reporters, education reporters, and it's the same sort of thing. With a big station, they're going to have people who are dedicated to this. And as you plow through the various different TV listings for, let's say, Denver, you'll see what their specialties are. The big stations will have these kind of guys. Often they will not. So again, the person you're probably going to turn to is the news director. At least that's where you want to start. With radio, well, radio is I worked in radio for a decade, and radio is pretty right-wing these days. Normally speaking, I'd say go to a news radio station like KGO, and specifically go to the talk show hosts who have talk shows. The reality these days, though, is that most radio stations are pretty right-wing. And second of all, if they're doing talk, they're using syndicated talk like Rush Limbaugh. So your chances of getting in there are pretty slim. I might also note that most of the NPR stations and even the semi-large markets, like Minneapolis as compared to Los Angeles, the NPR stations and the PBS stations are probably going to be pretty useless. They don't have a staff. They don't have news staffs. They don't have reporters often. They're pretty small. They're underfunded. So you can always try. Every once in a while something will work, but often you won't. Next slide, please. Okay, so what's the next thing we decided to do? Well, all right, we want to create a single one-stop shopping place for journalists to get the gist of what's going on, and not just journalists, but also the activists who are on the ground who are responding to the event in question. In this case, we wanted to have something up there that all these different college guys, college professors and such, whether they were in Massachusetts or California, could come to and get stuff that they could use when they wanted to basically confront Ray Comfort's people on their campus as they were handing out this bastardized version of the origin. So we created a dedicated website. So we secured the domain immediately, which was called don'tdissdarwin.com, which I thought was rather clever. And luckily we had some staff who had experience crafting a page to do this. I mean, this is not a really complicated page, but it's you're gonna have links and formatting, and we commissioned somebody who's a volunteer to do graphics. So it's a pretty decent looking page, all things considered. But suffice to say, the whole purpose was, pretty or not, is to have one nexus where people can come to that has all the resources that they can get. And so what do I have here? I mean, I have the talking points you can download, the 5-page, blow by blow handouts. We even have downloadable posters. Or if you click through the page and you go to it, again, it's don'tdissdarwin.com. We have links to prefab sites where basically we have the posters designed, like, Save Evolution. You click it and it takes you directly to the company that will actually print out the poster for you and mail it to you. So it's all kind of, again, like one stop. So we've got the information up there, our handouts out there, links to poster companies that will print posters for you on demand, all that kind of cool stuff, suffice it to say. Bibliography, links, video, whatever we could come up with, we did. So the next thing here, I'm trying to think here. Nick, thank you, Josh. Let's hold on that slide for a second. Okay, so advance one slide, Josh. Thank you. Yeah, okay, let's hold right there. Okay, so we've talked about handouts, we've talked about creating a dedicated website. Throughout all of this, part of what we did, and it was basically me and one of our staff geologists, Steve Newton, working together along with other staffers, but primarily Steve and I, we decided if we're going to do this sort of campaign, we might as well have fun, because humor kind of levens the mood, to say the least, but it also is memorable. People remember humor, they respond to it. I mean, every time I post something on our Facebook page from the Daily Show, we get a huge number of hits. So don't be afraid to use humor effectively for the issue at hand. In this particular case, we kind of tried to infuse everything with it to a certain extent. I mean, the handouts and certainly the website. If you look at that website carefully, you see that we've got this wax seal of Darwin with an arrow going through his head like Steve Martin. And suffice it to say, we thought, well, all right, the talking points can certainly have humor in them. Certainly the website can too as well. If you look at some of these downloadable protest signs we have, there's a little bit of wit with them. And of course, we did something silly like this thing right here, which was the NCSE safety bookmark, which we were basically saying, all right, you picked up a copy of this origin from Ray Comfort, and we want to make sure that it doesn't blow up. So you want to take this special safety bookmark, you want to put it right exactly at page 59, because that's where the real stuff, actual Darwin stuff, begins and you could ignore the intro. I mean, it was just our way of basically having fun with it and basically saying the intro is caca, just let it go. So suffice to say, we designed this bookmark, and the bookmark was available for download from our website, but we also had a bunch of them printed up and laminated, and we sent them off to the people who were working, at the Grassroots, and they really dug it. They got back to us and send us more, send us more. So suffice to say, something as silly as like this bookmark paid off. Next slide, please, Josh. Okay, so something else we decided to do because we figured, what the heck? And this, of course, really relied on our members helping us out. We thought, well, let's do a fake PSA. In other words, a public service announcement instructing people on how to deal with this bastardized version of the origin. I mean, down to the point where we had meat cleavers and we were chopping things in half, and it goes on and on. I mean, again, you go to don'tjustdarwin.com, you'll see the video. Hold on just a second. So anyway, so so we came up with this faux PSA, and we had to get costumes, we had to get props, we had to find a place to shoot it, we had to get somebody to actually to actually do the videotaping and so on. So we really leaned on our members. We sent out a note to all of our members and friends basically saying, hey, we need some help. And we got it. We got one of our members who was a well-known videographer locally, had a crew who could do the sound and the video, and also, thank God, the editing. We had another member who was a photographer, professional photographer, who did all the lighting for us and provided the venue. And we had a graphics pro from the Cartoon Network create all the graphics and animations that were folded into the video. And Josh, advance a slide if you would. Here's some of the stills from some of these animations that we had. And when all was said and done, the videographer cut the video for us. We posted it on YouTube. We promoted it like crazy, and boom, there was just thousands of people looking at this silly thing and having a laugh, and also getting the point that, well, maybe Ray Comfort is full of beans. So suffice it to say, that worked out pretty well. And Josh, if you could advance to the next slide. Okay, so meet the press. Okay, so dealing with the press. We've talked about this a little bit so far. Certainly, the standard thing that you get used to seeing, and has been the mainstay of dealing with the press, has been the press release. You hear about press release journalism, well, here it is. Something happens, an organization writes up a press release, and voila, you've got news. I will say this, that although I still write traditional press releases, and we have them on our press page and our website, I don't write a lot of them. I mean, the traditional press release was kind of for a different era. In this era, I often find myself basically sending a journalist a single paragraph. It's the elevator pitch. This has happened. You really need to know about it. I've got details. If you want to talk, call me. And from there, you can give them more background information about what's going on. But often I find I don't have to write this big, formal, standard press release, except for certain kinds of events. And in some ways, we write press releases almost for a matter of history. In other words, the press release is on our page. It's there as history. If you really want the details about Ray Comfort or the day we hired a new executive director, whatever, it's there. But like I said, a lot of times the contact I have with the press is much shorter. A killer subject line, one paragraph, that's it. And think of that subject line on that email that you're using. Again, email is the tool I use a lot of when I'm talking directly to the press. That subject line is a headline. Just like you'd see a headline in a newspaper. And the snappier that headline and the more informative that headline, the better. I mean, if you've got a choice, informative always comes first. But if you can make something that's informative and clever, well, we joke around here that if I can have a subject line that has the word Darwin and danger in the same line, I'm going to get twice as many hits as normal, because people are going to go, what? Darwin's in danger? Click, click, click. So there's that. There are news services out there that will distribute the press release for you. Now, you can do it yourself, obviously. You've got an email list that you've developed, and you want to hit all the journalists in Denver. Well, you can obviously email them the press release in some fashion, whether it's boiled down or whatever. But there are services out there that will do this for you. And if you're starting out and you really need to increase your visibility, it's something to think about. Organizations like Newswise, Eureka, or Eureka Alert, and others will basically distribute your press release to a vast range of journalists for a certain fee. It's not necessarily cheap. I think we paid, to Newswise, we paid $1,000 for, I think, posting 10 releases. And they have a whole form and everything you go through and everything. But it was a way of me raising NCSC's visibility very quickly. with a lot of journals and newspapers and so on that didn't really necessarily know about us. They may have wanted to find somebody like us, they just didn't know about us. So using something like one of these services, not a bad idea. Okay, another thing to remember is that journalists are always looking for a fresh hook. They're probably on your side, really, with the thing that you're probably talking about, whatever it might be. In our case, let's say evolution. They're probably on your side. They're probably interested in this. They're probably liberal-minded, but they need a hook because they're going to have to go back to their editor, their big boss, and say, hey, we need to tackle the subject again, but I've got a great new hook. The editor, that's what he's going to be looking for, and if you've got one, great. If you've got one, you can provide the journalist, great. Let's also talk about technology. Although you're going to communicate using Facebook and email, I must note that don't forget the valuable thing known as a telephone. And don't forget that very ancient thing that's also very useful is a fax machine. I know what you're saying. You're going like, a fax machine? But the thing is, if you're going to be dealing with newspapers, I mean, these guys are like dinosaurs anyway in some ways. I mean, some newspapers are more modernized than others, but chances are the newsroom has got a fax machine. And if you can't find that journalist's email address and the phone number is just taking you to a general thing, well, I use the editorial fax machine to send them a press release or to send them a note or whatever it is. And you'd be surprised what kind of response you get. I mean, sometimes if I'm doing a campaign, I'll email 600 outlets and I'll fax about 20. And I'll get pretty good results from the fax. So don't forget the fax machine. Another aspect of meeting the press. Now we've talked about the press release and email alerts and faxing, all this kind of stuff, and using distribution services like Newswise. Another part of meeting the press is prepping somebody local. You've got an issue that's going on. You've got some people in the town in question who can represent who are with you on what you're doing. Let's say they're a local professor. Let's say they're a geology professor at UT or something. Part of the process is that you want to prep these folks before they actually talk to the press. In other words, you want to give them talking points. If they're talking to TV, you want to talk to them about how they're going to dress. You want to remind them about the very proper role of sound bites. In other words, they need to come up with a very short, crystallizing aspect. Go ahead, Josh. Go ahead to that next slide. You want to prep them. So like I said, you want to prep them for the press. You want to talk to them about how they should dress. You want to give them talking points so they know how to stay on the rails. You want them to talk in sound bites a little bit so that they're kind of crystallizing what's going on. You might even want to do a mock interview with them, to get on the phone, over the phone, talk to them and see how they do and give them an idea of what kind of answers they should be, giving. You just kind of want to do that kind of legwork to make sure that the person who's out there in the field that you've discovered who really is willing to talk about this issue to the press is properly prepared. And if you do this, it really goes a long way towards getting your message out and getting it out appropriately. Next slide, Josh. Okay, my final chit-chat here, which is my lessons learned. And you can see what they are right there. Humor makes a big difference. Shorter is better in the sense that you don't need to give the journalist a 45-minute treatise about the scientific issues behind the issue in question. Give him 5 minutes. He doesn't have a lot of time, and he, so like I said, shorter is better. When something happens where you really need to get together a campaign like I did over this Ray Comfort thing, where you need to bring together disparate people to achieve a goal, you need to create a SWAT team, you need to put somebody in charge and make them accountable. That's important. The other thing I certainly learned from doing the Ray Comfort campaign is that pairing a scientist/expert with a communications person really pays off because you get the best of both worlds. The scientist can really explain what the heck's going on. The journalist can put it into terms that the press can understand, and they just kind of constantly talk to each other back and forth about this. And like I said, in this case with the Ray Comfort thing, Steve Newton and I were just basically joined at the hip for 2 weeks doing this, and it worked out pretty well. And that's all I got to say. Josh, back to you.
All right, thanks. So one thing that I would just emphasize from this that I think is a important lesson for people as they're building a local citizens for science group is that the way that a lot of the things that Robert was talking about are not things that we paid someone to produce a video. We knew someone who was involved in video production. We knew someone who could do animations. We knew someone who could do graphic design, and we could ask them to bring those skills to bear. And in building a Citizens for Science group and building a local campaign like this, be on the lookout for those sorts of opportunities, ways that you can bring in people who are not necessarily scientists, who are not necessarily educators, who don't have that background but who have other skills that they can bring to bear uh, can pay off hugely. Because I mean, and this media work is certainly another of those examples where just having someone who does this full time and knows how to do it right, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, can be a lot better than trying to do it all on your own. Find people who can do that, and that's something that Liz Craig, our next speaker, does. She's a media professional. She's on the board of Kansas Citizens for Science, where she has done a lot of their media work, especially through in 1999 and 2005, when Kansas was the epicenter of these battles nationwide. So I'm going to unmute Liz, and I'm going to pull up her presentation and let her get started.
Okay.
Yeah, you're on, Liz.
All right. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, good. My name is Liz Craig. You want to see me up there? Hello. I put on lipstick especially for you, audience. I have been with Kansas Citizens for Science since the very beginning. I'm a charter member. We founded ourselves in 2000, I believe, on the steps of the Natural History Museum in Lawrence. August 13th, I think it was. And since then, we've learned a lot of stuff we had to make up ourselves, and a lot of stuff NCSE and Jeannie in particular helped us with. Before I get started on this, listening to some of the other presenters, I've realized that one of the most important things that I think we've done is to connect people with other people. At one time, we had a Yahoo group where Wesley Ellsbury and Nick Matzik, if that is his correct name, participated with members of KCFS in discussions about, I think this was during the ID crisis, and eventually Wes and Nick both came to work for NCSE. And at another time when Jeannie was in Lawrence, I introduced her to Josh, and now he's working for NCSE, which we're very pleased about. So we have friends in high places and friends who have helped us over the years. All right, I'll just go ahead and get started. We are Kansas Citizens for Science. We've got a website. We have a Facebook page with more than 400 members on it. We've had to learn a lot as we went along. Are you controlling the slides, or am I?
You should be able to. If it's not working, it should work. But if it's not, just tell me and I'll advance for you.
What do I have to do?
You should just be able to click or mouse forward. It didn't seem like it was working for Robert, so if it's not working for you.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay.
Josh asked me to talk specifically about my involvement and how you attract somebody who's a media and PR person. I can tell you how I got involved. I don't know exactly how you can attract a PR and media person unless you just get the word out that you need one. What happened was my dear mother was a staunch church-state separationist, and she showed me a copy of Church and State, which is the magazine of Americans United. At that point, I had no idea that these types of people even existed. And I was working in Kansas City when the news came out that creationists were trying to get creationism taught in the schools, and I was red hot. I wasn't connected with anybody, but I called up someone and found out that there was going to be testimony at the next Board of Education meeting, and I took off work and I went there and I testified hotly at that meeting about the whole thing. At that time, the Board of Education was dominated by a creationist and headed by a creationist. There I met two gentlemen who were also testifying that day, and of course, as I said, my concern was separation of church and state, and that's always been my primary motivation. Go ahead, Josh. Eventually, skipping ahead, we got a meeting of about 70 or more activists who met in chaotic form at KU to form an organization. Nothing much came out of that meeting except that a core group got together and formed KCFS. And the rest of the people, I don't know what happened to them. Some of them became supporters. By virtue of the fact that our first president was a union organizer for the NEA, he was able to help us get 501c3 status with bylaws, which is important. And since then, we instigated monthly meetings in Topeka, which is central for our statewide organization. We have board members in Wichita, Manhattan, and even Hayes. And we meet the first Sunday after the first Wednesday, which is the day the Board of Education meeting happens. Go ahead, Josh. Okay, we had to kind of discover almost everything for ourselves, and depending on the people who were involved, we did various activities. It was always a matter of who's willing to do what. We can't just say, well, we're going to do this. We have to say, what do you think about that? Do you have time? Because everybody on our board and our followers on our listserv, which we established, were all employed and all had different interests. But we did put together a national science activist meeting where Jeannie Scott, Rob Pennock, and others came. And we had activists from 7 states, including Texas, which has arguably more problems than Kansas does. Really, we had some breakout activities and things, and I conducted a media and PR session. But the important thing was that we met other activists face to face, and we were able to talk with them about their experiences, what worked for them, what didn't work, what kinds of challenges they were facing. And for example, we have been very grateful to have New Mexicans for Science and Reason as our allies over the years, because they were around before we were. Next, Josh. Here's, you wouldn't believe it, but we had an all-day meeting to come up with this, what seems to be a simple purpose statement, but I think this is very important for a Citizens for Science organization to work out. Here's what we came up with. And one guy who wasn't there said, you spent all day doing this, you could have done that in 10 minutes. Well, no, we couldn't. We all had to decide that we were on the same page as to what we were about. So here it is. Kansas Citizens for Science is a not-for-profit educational organization that promotes a better understanding of what science is and does by advocating for science education, educating the public about the nature and value of science, and serving as an information resource. So all of the activities that we do fall under one of these 3 categories. Advocating for science education includes testifying before the Board of Education. Educating the public about the nature and value of science includes public education activities, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We produced a lot of flyers on various topics that we were able to put out at our public events. And serving as an information resource included serving as a resource for teachers or citizens who were feeling their educational process was being threatened by creationists or ideas, as well as activist groups in other states. Okay, next. Okay, we've testified at monthly Board of Education meetings when there was anything that was going on. We have staged events. Probably the biggest one was one that I helped organize, was Scopes Week. We've done Darwin's birthday parties at KU and in KC, and by the way, PR-wise, the birthday party at KU we decided that we wanted to definitely make it something the TV stations would come out for. So we actually had a professor from the theater department who had done Darwin, one-man Darwin show before, dress up as Darwin and give a little address. And we had birthday cake and punch for everybody. And about 100 people showed up on campus, and the TV cameras did show up as well. We had another party in Kansas City at Science City, and it was well attended. However, I don't think we got any press over that. Scopes Week was a big deal, and had I known how big it was before I proposed it, I don't think I ever would have gotten involved. But it involved speaker events in 5 towns across the state around the 75th anniversary of the Scopes trial. We had a professor, a constitutional law professor from UMKC, who has a website called Famous Trials. He's an expert on the Scopes trial, and on the actual anniversary, he gave a talk on the trial and described what happened. Also, Jeannie Scott came, and Michael Shermer of Skeptic Magazine, and Richard Milner, who has a one-man Darwin musical that is wonderful, came, and we put out a lot of flyers. We designed, a friend of ours who's a designer did a lot of flyers that we were able to send to the towns to put up and publicize the events, and most of them were very well attended. Flyers, news releases, volunteers, they all made it happen. During the ID threat, our current president, Jack Krebs, gave, I think it was a 3-part class in Evolution 101 at a Unitarian church here in the Kansas City area. Jack is a mathematician, but he knows, all of us have learned a tremendous amount about evolution and what is science and what is not. And that was also very well attended. I think we only had one creationist there, but that's not our target audience. By the way, we figured out our target audience is not people who are already in our camp and not people who are not in our camp and never will be. Our target audience is people who don't know what to think. They're on the fence. They wonder if they have to reject religion to accept evolution, and our message is, no, you don't. The only thing that's against, that won't mix with science is biblical literalism. And we are not down on religious people. In fact, we have a geologist on our board who is an evangelical Christian who has spoken widely around the country to student groups. And he was featured in the KGBH or WGBH evolution special, talking to students at Wheaton College. And I think he opened up a lot of their eyes. Anyway, next. I want to say once again that volunteers are important, and also coalitions are important. Scopes Week would not have happened unless we had had cooperation from Mainstream Coalition and Kansas humanist groups. They all pitched in to publicize and to help make these things happen. Volunteers in each Scopes Week town distributed flyers. They appeared on radio. They gave news interviews, and they organized the appearances. So volunteers, coalition partners, these are vital. Go on, next. As a media PR person for KCFS, I did at one time have a huge list of media contacts at newspapers, radio, and TV stations around the state. And there was a fellow at KU who was able to send out mass faxes, and we utilized him quite a bit in the early years. I wrote a weekly newsletter, then it became monthly, and distributed that to news outlets. That no longer exists. However, we now have a Facebook page. I had an article in NCSE Reports talking about the Kansas situation, and the first Darwin Day book also included an article by me about what had happened in Kansas in very brief form. Next. Today, our outreach, being an educational resource, informational resource, is sponsoring science cafes in several towns across the state They're very well attended. We get someone to speak on a scientific topic at either a bar or a coffee house, and we have lots of regular attendees as well as new people all the time. We post information about these science cafes and other events on our Facebook page, as well as interesting articles on science or education. We stay in touch with Board of Education members and know what's going on at the Board of Education meetings. And by the way, our board at this point is moderate, and everything's okay with the standards. However, the current thing is they're questioning, the legislature is looking into the Common Core standards, which all of the states had input into. They want to do away with the math and I think it's reading portions, but it's also a way of getting rid of the science standards that were adopted in 2010, the good science standards. So one thing I want to emphasize is that, at least in Kansas, it has gone from blatant creationist and ID attempts to get into the curriculum of schools, both downward from there into local school districts and upward from there into the state legislature. I am encouraging people to be aware of what's going on in politics in their state, because a lot of these measures that they're considering sound like one thing and actually are another. The threats to science education are still there. There are measures that would do away with sex ed. Right now we have a measure where, and we do consider this part of science, parents would have to opt in their children instead of opt them out if they don't want them to take it. As I said before, the threats are looking at the Common Core standards. And of course, every 2 years, half of our 10-member Board of Education is up for re-election. So we always face the possibility that the next Board of Education may not be as moderate as the one that we have today, and we may be back in the same hot water we were before. So next. Another thing that we do is our members participate in CATS Camp every year. For the past several years, we've had a booth there. That is where science teachers from across the state come to learn more about teaching science. And usually we have 2 or 3 presenters there, and we always have a booth. Oops, not yet. Did I do that? Go back. We have a booth, and we also award scholarships to teachers and their mentors to attend CATS Camp, and that has been very popular. Also, one thing I didn't mention, we bought a whole year's worth of, what are they called? They're little packets for teachers to use, or parents to use with their kids, to demonstrate simple science for kids who are 5 to 8 years old, or is it 5th to 8th grade? I can't remember. Magic Science Bus kits, that's it. And we gave some of these away at CATS Camp, and we get them every month, and I turn them over to Harry, and he takes them to CATS Camp and gives them away. So we spread that. And now, right now, nothing is going on in the way of overt threats, but we continue to meet now every other month, and we stay in touch via a listserv in between and our Facebook page. We do have a website, which is difficult for us to get updated, so I frankly never go there. It's really important for any of these groups getting started, get thyself a webmaster who can build and maintain your website. Otherwise, it becomes an archive, which is what ours is. If you ever want to go back and see what happened in 2000, what the standards were, how they were revised, and all that stuff, it's a great source of information. And we do put events on our homepage, but really the Facebook page is the place where it gets updated. And I think that's about all I have to say. So go ahead. Questions? And if you wish to reach me, I'm Liz at lizcraigwriter.com. And if you wish to go to our Facebook page, you can find it very easily, Kansas Citizens for Science. And our website is kcfs.org. Thank you for listening.
All right, thanks. So I think we were scheduled to go till noon, and we're actually a little bit past that. But I'm happy to keep chatting, and we can field questions and conversation as long as folks want. Again, if you have questions, if you want to type them on the side of your screen, there's a questions tab in the GoToWebinar app. You can ask them there, or you can, there's a way that you can signal that you want to raise your hand if you want to say something as well. Oh, apparently my audio is very low. Because the microphone is all the way up there. There we go. So, Patrick Van Slee asks, in terms of helping to guide public perception of the role of science, how can the media be encouraged to move away from using misleading headlines and broad extrapolations of potential future applications of incremental scientific developments and discoveries, and begin to create a stronger, more accurate story about how science really works? I'm going to send that to Aaron. Ha.
Hi. Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and it's a definite issue. You know, one thing we always try to do is not overpromise, and emphasize that we really can't always know the outcomes of science. So I think in terms of the media, you know, I think again those are messages to emphasize and to talk about the nature of science as much as possible and how it works exactly.
One thing I was just going to emphasize from what Liz was saying, and I've unmuted all of the panelists, so if people want to jump in, feel free. But you know, emphasizing the importance of sort of planning and organizing, and how crucial it is to have those volunteers and that local knowledge. One of the things that we do a lot when we're doing media outreach in response to something that happens is just write to the reporter after if they write a piece about a school board meeting that you attended. Maybe you didn't send them a press release, maybe you didn't contact them beforehand, but send them a note afterwards. And reporters never get nice notes. No one ever gets a note that just says, hey, you did such a great job, thanks. So if you send someone, a reporter, even if it's not that great a job, if you send them a note and say, hey, thanks for covering that school board meeting, it was really interesting, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there, but so it's so great to have reporters who are covering these things. I know how hard it is in this media environment to have someone at all these events, so it's great that your paper can still do that. And then you can say, oh, and by the way, you said that intelligent design isn't creationism, but here's some background on that. And I'm happy to chat more if you want to follow up on that down the road. That way you're in their Rolodex, they know that you're someone who knows what they're talking about, and that you're not a jerk, because they're probably getting a lot of just hate mail and rants and nonsense. So if you can come at them and just sort of, hey, thanks for doing that, it was great seeing that coverage, they're going to want to write back. They're going to want to be back in touch with you. If there's another meeting, or if there's something else, if there's a follow-up story that they want to do, they've had the information corrected, whatever they might have gotten wrong in the original story, and they know that you know something about it and can talk about it like a person rather than like a screaming, ranting person on the internet. So it works surprisingly well.
I might add that, yeah, what Josh says is quite true. And in fact, my standard subject line is kudos on coverage. And then when the journalist actually looks at the letter, I'm saying, you know, dear Sam, you know, saw your piece and blah, blah, blah. You nicely done, you know, hence this note. And then I go into my spiel about whatever it is that's going on. And if the journalist has gotten it wrong, my approach is very definitely kind of like, yeah, there's a lot to really, you know, to digest and so on. But, you know, when you find yourself in the similar circumstances, again, call us, because I've got all these experts online. And by the way, here are 3 experts you can call on in the future as well. So if you find yourself, so basically you're making yourself a resource center to the journalists, and they love that, because every journalist, especially a journal assignment reporter, is looking for the great, good interview. He wants that right up front, because if he finds the right person to interview at the very beginning of his task, that means he doesn't have to do another 15 interviews with people to get the whole picture. He can get it from 2 or 3 people, especially if you give him the first base interview that just covers the waterfront. It gives him a lot of resources and such. That puts you in his Rolodex for sure.
And there have been plenty of times where I've had an interview and I was talking to a reporter for 15 minutes, and the next day I see the story posted, and it's basically a transcript of our conversation. What Aaron was saying before about the modern media environment, where there are far fewer specialist reporters. It used to be even small town papers would have an education reporter who would cover the schools and cover the school board meetings, and who would sort of know what was going on, would understand these issues because they'd been covering it for a while and looking at what other education reporters are doing. And these days, that's not happening. The small town papers, even major market papers, often don't have a science desk. So there's not someone that a general assignment reporter, someone who's, today they're covering the school board meeting, tomorrow they're covering the fire downtown, and the next day they're covering something at the state legislature. You can't expect them to know the science, but you can work with them a little bit. You can give them the information, let them know that there are resources out there for them to come back to. And as you make that outreach, as you're organizing your local effort, have an Excel spreadsheet and just, I sent this person an email. This is the person who covered the school board meeting last month. Sometimes it'll be a different person every month, but often, even if it's not a formal beat, the paper will have some sort of, they will send the same person to the school board every month, because why not? So you can start to build those relationships. And then at the next one, they know to call you first. They call you beforehand. What should I expect to see at this meeting? What should I be on the lookout for? That can be really effective. Toby Horn is asking, what's the relative value of responding to a news article in the comment section versus emailing the reporter? I would email them. Usually, you can find an email. I'm not sure that reporters really are reading the comment sections.
No, they're not at all, unless they
No.
read something that was really, controversial or such. I mean, and generally speaking, most newspapers will have a staff listing somewhere, usually in the about or the contact space. It will give you either the reporter's email syntax, first name _ last name @ or the actual address. But like I said, sometimes you may just have to pick up the telephone and call.
But I will add, the comment section is a good way to reach out to regular readers. If they're commenting, they're probably there a lot, and so it is useful to some degree in that sense.
And letters to the editor can be really effective, even though people don't necessarily, how often do you read the letters to the editor page? But it's a way to signal to the editors what the audience is interested in. So if they're getting a lot of pro-evolution letters, they might only run 1 out of the 10 letters that they get. But if they're only getting creationist letters, then that tells them, oh, our audience is really pro-creationism, so and maybe that shapes how they cover the story or whether they cover certain stories. So
Josh,
coordinated letters to the editor campaigns can be really powerful tools also.
Yeah, one time we had a letter writing cadre, and that was during the height of everything, and I think that was helpful. One thing I wanted to is what I mentioned to you before, the feather and the bowling ball being equal thing, where they think he said is important as what he said, and creationism and science deserve equal coverage. You don't see that quite so much anymore, but it's really, it emphasizes the need for those talking points and the backgrounding of reporters. We've never had a science reporter. We had an education reporter, and during the ID hearings, I did cry, begging her to please not treat it like intelligent design was science, and she just said, well, it's my duty to report both and let the readers make up their mind. And I think there's some of that.
And often,
well, on the ping pong journalism that that Liz is talking about, where the reporter feels obliged to cover both sides, one way I've combated that is making sure that the information I give the journalist is far more complete, understandable, and so on, compared to what the other side may be providing. And even though they've gone to a panel and they've seen both sides talk, what I do, let's say after I've had an interview on the phone with a journalist, or let's say after an event, is I send them a little care package. I send them, details on, here's the experts you really want to talk to. And by the way, here are the 2 articles that really explain what intelligent design is really all about, and you should know about this. And if I give them a packet that really has good sources, they'll love you forever, and they'll tend to quote from that more than they will from something else. I find it especially useful that after, let's say, Josh has given an interview with somebody at the Atlantic Monthly, if we follow up immediately with an email to that journalist, basically reiterating the points that Josh just made, so that he has it in black and white. So if his notes are messed up or he doesn't quite get what Josh was saying, it's in black and white for him to basically cull for the article that he's writing.
And the sort of opinions on the shape of the Earth differ type coverage. One of the things in Liz has for those of you who are watching the video, a shirt that KCFS produced with the science discoveries on one side and the creation science discoveries on the other side. One of them has text, the other doesn't in those columns.
They proved very, very popular.
And this is also why I love things like Project Steve, because it really shows the difference in scope.
And it's using humor, so it's something that the reporter can get, and it's not, if you're responding on this very intellectual level to what the creationists are saying, then a reporter who may not have taken a science class since high school might just look at it and say, well, there are a lot of people who seem very smart who are saying things that might be right. I don't know. I'll let the reader decide. Or you might get to the reporter. The reporter might get it and see, yes, there's not a legitimate scientific controversy here. But then they take it to their editor, and the editor says, look, you need to get a quote from the other side. I'm sorry, this has to be balanced. And there's nothing you can necessarily do. There's not a ton you can do about that. But having things like the Kitzmiller ruling was hugely important. In Kansas, in 2005, the both sides sort of coverage, the ping pong coverage, the opinions on the shape of the Earth differ, was really common. But since then, since Kitzmiller, when you had a federal judge come in and say, intelligent design is creationism, you can't teach it in school, it's a lot easier to just send a reporter a link to that and say, look, a federal judge looked at this, thought about it carefully, here's where it is. On climate science, you've got things like the IPCC consensus reports where all of the climate scientists in the world got together and thought about what the state of climate science is. Here's what it says. And if you have something that can be authoritative like that you can give to a reporter, it gives them ammo to take to their editor and say, look, it's not a two sides thing. There's been a resolution to this. We can't report. It's wrong it's misleading the readers to give them that two sides sort of thing. Wes Ellsbury asks if you guys have any tips on writing op-eds and getting them published.
One thing I would say is make sure to contact the newspaper and know the op-ed guidelines. A lot of times there are word limits, for example. Another thing I would say is if you do submit one and it doesn't run right away, don't be discouraged, because a lot of times these newspapers are bombarded, and so if it doesn't work the first time, try and try and try again. And a third thing I would say is try to time it to a news hook of some sort.
Yeah, the news hook makes a big difference. I've certainly discovered that if I want to get an op-ed into the hands of the editorial page editor, if I have a connection at the newspaper, in other words, I talk to a regular reporter there on a regular basis, I'll say to the reporter, will you hand this to the op-ed person? And they'll go, oh yeah, sure, no problem. And that usually gets it to the top of the stack. The other thing I've done, which of course they say you're not supposed to do ever, never, 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 but I do it all the time, is simultaneous submission. If you've written an op-ed that you think is really hot and timely, I will go to like the top 3 newspapers to start with and see if I get a response from them, and then I'll go to the next 5, and then I'll go to the next 5, because in spite of what they say about not wanting simultaneous submissions, you will grow old and gray waiting for a response from 60% of the newspapers you submit to. I mean, case in point, we wrote an op-ed related to the Bill Nye debate a couple weeks ago, right at just about the right time, and I submitted it to 9 newspapers, and I only got a response from 3. So.
Yeah, I think being timely is certainly important, and who the author is, and it's even if you get rejection is a lesson also. I've found Twitter to be a really great way to sort of hone my messaging skills. Figuring out what gets retweeted, what gets picked up, what do people
get really jazzed about. Blogging is also really great for longer form sorts of things. What resonates with people? And if you send out an op-ed and it doesn't get printed, that's a lesson. There was something that you could have done differently, maybe that would have maybe it was just the wrong pitch at the wrong time, but maybe you look back at it, or you can even write to the editor and say, what wasn't working about this, and maybe you'll get a response, maybe you won't, but it doesn't hurt to ask. And you can get feedback from journalists. Often they're not like some secret priesthood that doesn't want to talk to you. If you do an interview with someone and say, did that interview go well? I don't really know. This is my first interview. How was it? They might say, yeah, we're really good, but there were a lot of ums, or you had this one phrase that you kept saying. I'm going to have to edit that out. People will be helpful. So don't be afraid to just ask straight up for that sort of advice, and to use rejections, or to use places where you thought you had a good interview and you weren't quoted. There's a lesson there. Maybe your talking points need to be tweaked. Maybe you need to think about a different. Was there not a soundbite where was everything you were saying multi-sentence, multi-clause paragraphs that weren't quotable? Do you need to just rethink that?
Josh, on that topic, when we had the kangaroo court in Kansas, one of our scientists was talking to some reporters, and he was doing what you're talking about, and I had been trying to drum into their heads, talk in sound bites. You have to spoon feed them exactly what you want them to take away. They're not looking to be educated. They're looking for a line, not a lecture.
Short and memorable, that's the bottom line.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, understanding, this is the same thing that we talked about with lobbying, that it's really important to understand what the reporter is looking for. The reporter is probably coming in, they have an idea of what the story is going to look like, and there's a certain amount of education you can do. There's a certain amount of nudging that the story is really not that. The story is really this thing over here. You can do a little bit of that, but not a ton. So be realistic in your expectations. Think about what the reporter is going for, and recognize that the reporter knows their audience better than you do. That's something that you can learn from. If they're looking in a particular direction, they probably know something about what sort of story is going to get read, what's going to get picked up. And if one reporter is interested in that angle, maybe others are. Maybe that shapes how you send out your next press release, or the next pitch that you send for the next reporter. So it's don't be afraid to adapt as you go along.
Well, as Josh said earlier, it's like supplying that writer with ammunition that's going to get him past his editor. And having been one of those editors many years, it's like it's got to be good.
And Christy Harley asks, we've talked about the importance of stories and anecdotes. What about stories and anecdotes regarding scientists' lives, like Darwin's life? Does the public really know who Charles Darwin was as a person?
I think that's the kind of thing that would get people interested in Charles Darwin. So definitely, I would encourage that.
I would like to say one thing about that. In our early years, we did a lot of talking about Darwin. And of course, he's very important. But once the ID people and the creationists started calling people who accept evolution Darwinists as a kind of a catch-all for atheists, we stopped emphasizing Darwin quite so much, and we started emphasizing the consensus science, because evolution hasn't been Darwin's evolution for a long, long time. It's very much advanced these days. And we don't diss him. I mean, in fact, I've got a Darwin t-shirt that I wear as much as I can, but you have to be aware of what that name means to different audiences.
And especially for reporters, I think, where they really are looking for what's new. Talking about, here's a story from the 19th century only gets you so far. But talking about, your story is always the most powerful story to tell. Because if the reporter is talking to you, why is this important to you? What got you up in the morning to attend this school board meeting and go and harass a reporter to make them write the right story? Right? What makes this important to you? If the reporter is going to key off on that and is going to they're more likely to find an angle out of that personal story, I suspect. Although you can certainly bridge from there to, this is really important to me because there is this long history there, and I think we shouldn't ignore that. You can connect to it, but I think starting from yourself and building from there. Don't be afraid. Scientists are often trained not to use I in professional writing. Not true in talking to the press. The first person is your friend.
Yeah, the story is all. Certainly, it's very important. The add-on to that, though, that every journalist is going to be looking for is not only just a good story and a good hook, is that ultimately they're also going to want to have some sort of information that they can at least lean on. And that means that you give them a great story, you give them a great hook, and then you say, and by the way, here's a PDF report of the issue in question that goes for 300 pages, and look at the executive summary on page 4, and you'll have all the data that you need to pull out. I mean, I remember when I was covering the Democratic National Convention one year, and I was talking to the guy who was in charge of all the computing and all the stuff that was on the floor, and he said, now that I've told you the story of how we did it and how then those blood, sweat, and tears, here's the data that you want. How many computers we have, what the transmit speed was, blah, blah, blah. All the nuts and bolts that every reporter wants to have. And even for a story relating to, grassroots activism, evolution, whatever, if you can also point to 3 studies that support your point of view or 2 surveys that do, you want to include that in the package along with your story.
Scott Goodman suggests CCing reporters, or if you send a letter to a representative or a state board of education member or something, that you include that. You also send that same thing to reporters so that they're pre-educated and that they know what the conversation is that's happening there. That seems like good advice. Have any of you guys had success with that? Or is that going to turn reporters off? Is that going to make them feel like is that too generic?
I think I would suggest giving some context, but I don't think it's a bad approach per se. I think it shows that it helps set the frame. Sorry, it helps set the stage for the issue, but you do want to add some context so they don't feel like they are just getting a letter that wasn't really meant for them.
And Patricia Princehouse has a comment here about using different levels of the press for different reasons. That letters to the editor can be good for some purposes, op-eds can be better for other purposes, talking to editorial writers, or for other purposes, talking to bloggers. That there are different levels. You're going to reach different audiences through different media, and thinking about what you're trying to accomplish. I don't know if any of you, if you guys have any. Oh, that's not what she meant. She's writing to me. Okay, I'm just going to read it. I'll read what it says. Also, using different levels of the press for different purposes. Not only letters, op-ed, editorial writers, but also we use bloggers for more sensational stuff and fundraising, weekly local tabloids for in-depth and edgy material, and even school papers. Once, for instance, contents of the governor's office emails is in print in some way, it becomes acceptable to editors that would refuse to be the first source to break various kinds of information, building the case strategically. So I don't know if any of you guys have had similar experiences of that's something that starts off that the press isn't quite sure what they want to do with, but once it's started rolling somewhere else, you can push the story a little bit more effectively.
Well, it's another case where you need a lot of volunteers in different areas to get the story out. I don't know.
I certainly have played against newspapers' egos. In other words, gee, it's being covered in the Herald, you guys haven't covered it. That would sometimes spur a reporter and editor to get off the stick and actually cover said story, and I've used that technique many times.
And I think the point is to be strategic about who you're reaching out to and what that audience is.
Yeah, at one of the sessions at the AAAS meetings last week, I think Carl Zimmer talked about sort of wanting artisanal press releases. Don't just blast everything out to everybody, but really think about who are the reporters that are going to be interested in this story and what's going to interest that one reporter about this story, and send them. It doesn't have to be the full-blown traditional press release with the canned quotes and the whole thing. You can have that as a resource for people who are interested, but one sentence email, hey, Carl, I hear you. Did you hear about this cool new paper? it may not have to be any more than that if you know that reporter, or you can mention did you I know you've written about horses before. Here's this new horse evolution paper that you might want to cover. And for someone else, it's not about the horses; it's about something else. So each of the pitches might be a little bit different as you're looking at a spread of different media outlets that might cover the story.
And that gets down to a certain extent tracking who you've been talking to and who you are talking to. I've certainly created sort of like this massive dossier list of all these different journalists I've talked to over time, recording what they've interviewed us for in the past, what their interests are, the articles that they've written, what kinds of stuff they're interested in, so that when I'm trying to craft a press release specifically for them or a subset of guys like them, I have a rough idea of what to pitch and what not to pitch.
And as you do that, they start to know who you are, and they start to come to you, which is when you know you've really succeeded, is when you've gotten yourself visible enough that reporters, they are not waiting for you to reach out to them with information, but that they've picked up that you are an information asset. And it doesn't have to be an organized group like KCFS. It can be, I mean, when I was before I was at NCSE, before I was involved with KCFS, I had started this blog. And what does a reporter do when they start covering a story in a place? It's someone from the Washington Post. He's stationed in Chicago, doesn't know anything about Kansas, so he Googles, Kansas evolution, and for whatever reason, my blog comes up to the top. I'm just some random grad student. I'm not involved in the process in any particular way, but I'm writing about it. So he calls me, right? So positioning yourself so that you can get those calls, and then having the talking points, having the preparation in place so that you can do something with them when they arrive is really key. And this is something, there was an earlier question that someone had asked about, what do you do if you're asked a gotcha question, or if you're asked a question that you weren't prepared for, and there's that pause, that sort of deer in the headlights, like, oh my God, what do I even say to that? And that's something where I wrote back to offline about, having those talking points in place can be really good because it gives you something to say while you're thinking about what you really want to say. It gives you a starting place that, every question can start out about the importance of this one issue, and then while you're saying the same thing that you've said a couple of times in the interview already, you can be thinking, okay, where is this question coming from? What's a response that's going to be not totally off topic, but that keeps us on what we want to be talking about, and not on whatever ideological agenda someone might come into an interview with.
And the thing is, I know that being quoted is nice, especially getting publicity for our organization, but ultimately the bottom line is getting the issue out there. So a lot of times if you're just providing background for the journalist, well, that's not bad at all. I mean, you're providing background. When you look at the actual piece, you won't see your name anywhere. But funny how all these paragraphs go in the sequence you talked about and reflect the talking points that you laid out there. And Josh is quite right that when you get to the point where the journalists are contacting you, it's just gravy. Case in point for us was the Bill Nye debate. I mean, within the course of just a handful of days, we started getting pelted by everybody. Literally 10 minutes before the debate, we got a call from CBS, TV, news, wanting, gosh, can you talk to us about this? I'm thinking, God, guys, talk about cutting it close. But I mean, yeah, that's what happens.
And I think on the issue of gotcha questions, it's certainly okay not to know the answer, and there are ways to redirect. You can say, for example, I have not encountered that issue, but here's what I have seen. Or something like that. There are ways to take it back to the key message that you want to get across.
Politicians do it all the time.
Exactly.
Yeah, and there's a whole, in media trainings that I've done, we sometimes talk about the idea of bridging, which is, it's a trickier thing. It's sort of, if what we're doing right now is sort of media skills 101, this is maybe 102, but it's, the example that I love is when Ted Kennedy was running for president, he had an education plan that he wanted to talk about. And it was, the MX missiles and all sorts of stuff was happening. Reagan was talking about that. And so reporters would come to candidate Kennedy and say, well, what's your response to this that's happening on the defense budget side of things? And he would say, well, the MX missile system is going to cost this many billions of dollars, and I think we could use that money better on education. My education plan would do X, Y, and Z, right? So in one sentence, he's gone from talking about missile systems to talking about his education plan. And then he can spend 5 minutes talking about his education plan. And he's answered the question. I mean, he's responded to the question. He doesn't think that the missile system is a good idea, but the quote is going to be about his education plan. So if it's a trickier technique to be able to pull off on the fly. So I'm not necessarily recommending it to all of you right now, but knowing that that's something that you can do, it's allowed. You don't have to answer every question exactly the way that the person asked it. Often it's going to be edited, and the question will often not be part of whatever is edited out in a TV interview. So if you're asked a dumb question that you don't want to answer the question you wish you had been asked, and make it so good that they'll use that clip anyway. And Patricia Princehouse adds, often reporters don't know what to ask. Don't try too hard to parse and answer the question they ask. Answer a more interesting or appropriate question. And never throw away reporters will usually at the end of the interview say, is there anything we didn't talk about? Is there anything you wanted to add? Never say, no, I think we covered it all. That's your chance to go through your talking points one more time. And your talking points are like 3 things, no more than 3 things that are like big, important ideas that you can come back to and say, here are the three important things that I really wanted to get across. Say them again, concisely, quickly, quotably, and it's remarkable how often the things that I've said in that last little snippet are what winds up getting quoted, because by then we've done the interview, we've talked it through, I've practiced what I wanted to say, the reporter knows where it's going, and so that's the most the pithiest, most quotable version of it. And yeah, Patricia adds that the number one question underlying what reporters are doing is often, what's the harm? What's the danger here? Why should anyone care? So finding ways to having that hook there, uh, not certainly over dramatizing anything, but making it personal to the reader as well as to the reporter. It should be plausible, but it shouldn't be so, well, students are going to learn some things and it might not be so great and that would be a shame. It's something worse than that. There's something scary about it that has you concerned, that has your Citizens for Science group coming together, or that just has you out pounding the pavement talking to reporters. Find that thing and think clearly about how to articulate that beforehand. You don't necessarily have all of your sound bites mapped out beforehand, but practicing a little bit is certainly a good idea. Have a friend, if you've got a friend who's a reporter who can do some practice interviews with you, ask them to do that before you do it. Just run through it a couple times, see how it goes.
And
Hugely
Josh,
valuable.
I did realize one time that a lot of these current attacks that could affect science education are not directly aimed at science education. There'll be things in the legislature. So you might have a good relationship with the education reporter or the science reporter, but you need to get a relationship with the politics reporter at the state capitol and point out to them what's going on with this legislation really, because they're going to be disguised as something that sounds like something else, but as you know, the Common Core standards being challenged, that's a challenge to math and science. So get another media list for those kinds of things.
Yeah, and that's someplace where, especially with these really subtle sorts of the academic freedom style bills that are being introduced these days, where they sound just mom and apple pie, right? How can you be against academic freedom and critical thinking? But what's happening underneath the surface is what's scary. And so having reporters who are prepped on that, so that when a bill gets filed, you're not playing catch up, but that you're sending an email to the people who cover the State House saying, did you hear about this bill that was filed, or this bill that became law in Louisiana? Is there anything similar happening here? Have you heard about the efforts to repeal it? Have you heard about how all of these Nobel Prize winners have signed a letter saying that it's a bad bill and it's dangerous? So that when it gets filed in your state, they're ready. The reporters are ready for it, and they're not sort of stuck just trying to play catch up. That you've already sort of seeded things a little bit, so that they know to contact you about it. One, but that they have the context for it. They understand why it's so scary, and you're not trying to do it on the fly, because it's always harder to do any of this. To do the media outreach, to develop talking points, any of these things, to do it on the fly is a lot harder than if you can do the prep work ahead of time, even a little bit.
Well, another thing is they will try things in one state to see if it works, and then they'll bring it to another state. So if you see something happening in another state, you can keep your feelers out there for something happening like that in your state and be aware of it ahead of time. Know what I mean?
Looking through the question. Yeah, so we're well past when we said we'd quit. There's still about 30 people logged in here, so we can keep going. We're getting some comments. Some of the questions that we're having sort of touched on topics we already covered, like what to do about people balancing, quote unquote, balancing science with propaganda. Was there anything that anyone wanted to add on that? We just spent some time on that, but is there anything anyone wanted to add?
It's just a matter of providing more information and emphasizing that science rests on fact and research, whereas anything else, whether it's called creationism or ID, rests on nothing. In that Nye-Ham debate, the crucial thing was when they asked both of them what would change your mind. And Nye said science or reality, something like that.
Evidence.
And Ham said nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think anything you can do along the way to convey that part of science, not just here's what the science says, but here's how science works, here's how we got this information, can be hugely valuable. Because reporters, like I said, a lot of the general assignment reporters you're going to be talking to haven't had a science class since high school, and they probably didn't really like it. And that's probably who their readers are also. So getting across, here's what science is, here's how science works, and here's how it's different than religion, than politics, than these other topics, can be really valuable as background, as sort of laying that foundation for here's how we know these things in a way that's reliable and that's not just a matter of personal opinion. It's not just our beliefs, it's what the evidence is. And sometimes a line that I like to use is say, I don't believe in evolution. Right? You sort of that pulls people up short for a second. You can say, I don't believe in gravity either. Right? It's not about what I believe. I believe that the Cubs are the greatest team in baseball, regardless of what the evidence might show. But in terms of in terms of evolution, in terms of gravity, in terms of science, it's about what the evidence shows. And so turning that around, then it gives the reporter ammo if they have to go to their editor then and say, here's why. I'm not setting, I'm not giving two quotes on this that say that opinions differ, because that's not what the evidence is, and it's not about opinions. And that's something, because political reporters are trained to present two sets of opinions. That's how they're trained. That's from journalism school on. It's what the reporters want. It's not how science journalists are trained. Science journalists are trained to talk to the scientists and figure out what the science is and report it. It's a different sort of reporting that they do, and their editors expect something different. It's just a different enterprise. So know those differences. Understand where the reporters are coming from.
Since I'm the one who comes from the local level, I guess maybe I need to put it in perspective this way. I just read that 4 out of 10 Americans think that the sun revolves around the Earth. And I'm not sure that most reporters at our level are much different from that. There was a quote that said a Republican strategist was telling his people, if it's too complicated to explain with a crayon, then it's too complicated. So, that's a big challenge when you have scientists as your source. They want to speak in scientific terms, and you've got to break it down so people can understand. And also what the implications are for their everyday life. Who cares about global climate change? Well, your house is going to flood and wash away. That's pretty bad. Consequences of what these people want to teach and what these people are saying.
Yeah, and that personal connection. It's my house is going to flood. It's not there's going to be flooding somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
We got a question here that's probably a good wrap-up question for us. Um, what do each of you think is the single most important aspect of the evolution climate change PR problem? And I'll add, or what do you think are the greatest opportunities? What are the things that you wish everyone who's on this call would do?
Well, I'll jump in. I think the biggest problem is oil companies with money funding a lot of grassroots groups who are getting people to believe that global climate change is not happening and is just a big hoax. That's it in a nutshell. The Koch brothers, we're very proud of them in Wichita, of course, along with the Phelps gang. It's money in politics. It's money affecting education even. Koch brothers have bought a department at Stanford so that they can put their own professor in there to teach what they want. And increasingly, this sort of thing is happening. The erosion of knowledge due to people who have a lot of money that don't want the truth to get out. Okay, I'm done.
I would say the biggest challenge with these issues is if you say to someone, why not teach both sides? It sounds only fair, right? I think the average person might say, sure, why not if there are two sides? So that is a huge challenge. And Josh, you already talked about it, but I think that's a tough one to sometimes combat. And in terms of opportunities, what I hope you all go out and do, I think there are many, many different ways to get engaged, and it depends a lot on your comfort level, your experience, and the time you have. So I would say go to some of the websites, go to NCSC, and reach out to your organization or university communications folks and talk to them.
From my perspective, I think the thing that worries me the most is literacy, or the lack of same. I mean, people come up to me at some of these conferences I'm at, and it's clear they've never had a science class, and they certainly don't understand the scientific method. They think it's a black box. Mysterious things go in, and something comes out the other end, and nobody knows how it works. And I have to reemphasize to them that it's, in fact, a completely transparent process, and it's all about evidence and proving what you're doing and verifying and so on and so forth. And I do see the light bulb go on, but not very often. I mean, the lack of literacy, of science literacy, the lack of understanding of the scientific method really bugs me. And if I had my druthers, every high school would have a mandatory critical thinking class. Because this is something that I'm really not seeing. I'm seeing people who are well educated, who are articulate and bright, who come up to me and say the damnedest things. And I go, where did you get that? Or yes, the common both sides argument. And the thing I'll put to them is I'll say, well, okay, your kid's taking chemistry, right, in high school? And they'll go, yeah. And I go, so are they also being taught alchemy? Well, no. And I said, well, okay, your kid's taking physics, right? Yeah. Okay, you also getting astrology and cosmetology? Well, no. I said, well, then why are you having intelligent design and creationism being taught side by side with biology in your daughter's high school? I mean, you really think it through. So for me, it's the critical thinking aspect.
Well, I think we covered a lot of ground there. I appreciate all of you guys, panelists and attendees, for your time and thoughts. I think this went really well. I'm really pleased. We are going to do this again next month. The theme is going to be clergy outreach, which we was sort of touched on in passing a little bit here, but it's been a huge theme in some of the previous sessions that we've done on lobbying and on just again in that spirit of that it's about the volunteers, it's about having a broad network, being able to connect reporters to clergy, being able to have clergy come with you when you're lobbying, having them as part of the coalition is a hugely valuable in doing any sort of organizing, especially around science issues, where there can be a perceived tension between science and religion. Undercutting that and being able to have people across that supposed divide can be really important. So we're still putting together the details, but all of you who attended this will get the first notice about it, and you will also all get very soon a notice about a survey for feedback on this. If there are things you would have done differently, if there are other topics we didn't get to that you wish we had, that we can do in a later webinar, fill that out, let me know, and we'll try to build that in. So thank you all so much, especially to the great panel, and I'll see you all next month.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.